That video gets me every time. I love it. Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining me today. My name is Megan Leslie, and I'm President and CEO of the World Wildlife Fund Canada. And I'm coming to you from Toronto, the traditional territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. And we're joining in this virtual meetup from all over the country. So I'd love to know what traditional territories you're joining us from. Feel free in the comments section, just put it in there. I'd love to read where everybody's coming to us from. I am really excited to be a part of this Facebook Live event. We're going to be discussing Indigenous-led conservation, and we have two really special guests joining us. I know I have a lot of questions lined up for them. I imagine you might have some questions too, so feel free to take this opportunity to ask them. All you need to do is put your questions in the comments section, and we'll do our best to get to them. Now, to set the context for our conversation, earlier this month, WWF-Canada launched the Living Planet Report Canada 2020. And in this report, we found that Canada's at-risk wildlife are facing troubling declines. We hosted two other Facebook Lives to dive deeper into the overall findings of the report and to look at species at risk recovery in Canada. If you're interested in those conversations, you can find them on our Facebook page. So kind of go back in time and have a look. While the Living Planet Report Canada, it does have some pretty stark findings, I want you to know that it's not all doom and gloom. There are solutions to wildlife loss, and that's why we're here today. We're actually going to feature one of the solutions that we discuss in the report, and that's the solution of Indigenous-led conservation. At WWF, we consider Indigenous-led conservation to be the most effective, equitable, and efficient way to safeguard nature. And I want to jump into the conversation, so let's get started. Lucky for us, for all of us, both of our guests were co-chairs of the Indigenous Circle of Experts. The Indigenous Circle of Experts submitted a report in 2018 outlining a pathway to achieving Canada's 2020 goals of protecting 17% of terrestrial and inland waters by 2020. So the Indigenous Circle of Experts, sometimes we refer to them as ICE. You'll probably hear us say ICE quite a bit. And in their report, ICE put forward recommendations for Indigenous protected and conserved areas, which we're probably going to shorten in our conversation to IPCAs. So IPCAs, or Indigenous protected and conserved areas, these are lands and waters where Indigenous governments and communities have the primary role in protecting and conserving ecosystems through Indigenous laws, governance, and knowledge systems. So let's bring in our guests. First, I'd like to introduce the unstoppable Danika Littlechild. Danika is an assistant professor in the Department of Law and Legal Studies at Carleton University, and she's a member of the Ermineskin Cree Nation. Danika, welcome, and please take a moment to introduce yourself to everyone joining us.
Thank you so much, Megan and WWF Canada, for inviting me to join you in this Facebook Live event today on this very important and urgent topic of Indigenous-led conservation here in Canada and beyond. Really pleased to be joining you from Ottawa, which is the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe. And I myself am from Niasqueak, Musqueam in Treaty 6 territory, out in Alberta. And so I'm a little far away from home, but my heart is always there. So I'm very pleased to be with all of you today.
Well, thanks. We're just thrilled that you're able to join us. Our next guest is Eli. Oh my gosh, Eli, I've lost your introduction. The indefatigable Eli Enns. Here you are, President and CEO of the Iisaak Olam Foundation. And Eli is a member of the Colloquiet Nation. Eli, welcome. And please say a few words about yourself.
Yeah, thanks, Megan. My name is Eli. I'm from Tlaloquit, like you said, on the west coast of Vancouver Island on my dad's side of the family, and Winnipeg, Manitoba on my mom's side of my family. I'm joining you all here from the east coast of Vancouver Island in Coast Salish territory. And just happy to forward the conversation about Indigenous-led conservation and how we can collectively, address some of these challenges that you've identified.
Excellent. You two are the real experts, and I'm so glad we have you. I am just noticing in the chat, though, also Valerie Courtois is joining us from home. And she is another incredibly strong voice on Indigenous-led conservation. Valerie, feel free to weigh in the comments section at any time. We'd love to hear from you, and hello. Okay, so let's get started. Danika, in both the ICE report and also in WWF Canada's Living Planet report, you spoke about something called ethical space. What does that mean, and how do you think ethical space, what that kind of approach could really change conservation in Canada? Tell us a bit more about that.
Sure. Ethical space is an approach that proposes to transform relationship. It's an approach that proposes to elevate Indigenous systems to a position of equity with non-Indigenous systems. So often in the past, we have seen Indigenous peoples be subsumed within structures that are imposed upon them, especially when it comes to conservation movement. We've sort of seen what we thought of as progressive ideas of including things like so-called traditional ecological knowledge, or bringing in Indigenous story or narrative. But I think we need to sort of get to the moment where we can understand Indigenous people's systems as a whole and recognize the importance of elevating those systems to a place and space where we can truly enter into collaborative and true strong partnerships that are empowering of Indigenous peoples and their systems, their laws, their languages and cultures and practices, stewardship practices, etc., economies. We really want to ensure that those things are brought up to a level that they've never been before. Mm-hmm. Part of the reason that we feel this is possible is because we've seen some emerging standards, in particular in the last 10 or 15 years now, that are helping us to sort of collectively imagine a different future together. One of those is, of course, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And for us in Canada as well, I think the watershed moment for so many Canadians was the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada calls to action. I think also that we have important foundations from which to work as well that are part of the framing of ethical space. In addition to the UN Declaration and the TRC calls, we must also think about constitutionally protected rights and what those actually mean in practice, in particular when it comes to conservation and decisions about the environment. We know from very recent history in the news that exercising rights is still quite controversial. Yeah. And we really need to ensure that Indigenous peoples do not continue to be criminalized for exercising the rights that are expressed as a minimum standard of rights, meaning the floor and not the ceiling. And we want to also ensure that other emerging standards around conservation are brought into practice and function in a way that allow Indigenous peoples, that give Indigenous peoples a rightful role in stewardship and decision-making related to environmental management.
Thanks for that. Eli, when I think about what Danika said about raising up these rights and how traditional conservation has maybe, Danika, what was the word you used? Subsumed Indigenous voices?
Yeah.
So let's go back a little further then. For those of us learning about this idea of ethical space right now, how has traditional conservation excluded people, Indigenous people and knowledge? And maybe can you share with us what some of the negative impacts have been for people, but also for nature?
Yeah, for sure. The conventional approach to parks and protected areas has actually been a part of the colonial or industrial agenda, if you like. And they both wellspring from the same worldview that sees the world in disconnected pieces. To say that, okay, here's all of our land here, this part we want to keep nice for nature, where we can go forest bathing and camping, or
Yeah.
end of the day weekend or whatever. And then the other part of your territory, you're going to sacrifice to the industrial gods, so to speak. That is a disconnected way from seeing the world. And by the way, both approaches to relationship with land fundamentally see humanity as separate from nature and above. Separate, not just separate, but above. So we're not talking just about, elevating Indigenous worldviews through ethical space and two-eyed seeing and so on and so forth. We're also talking about the other things in creation that, I love how Dr. Reg Croshu put it in one of our videos about IPCAs. Is he said, I'm not above the rock, or I'm not above the buffalo. We all sit at the same level in creation. And so, rounding back to your question, Megan, the conventional parks and protected areas, I mean, if you think about it, back in the early 40s or 30s or whatever, nature on the whole across Canada and the world, really, I mean, it was in a much better state than it is today. Mm-hmm. So what was the purpose of creating that park? Mm-hmm. The Riding Mountain National Park is an example where the Anishinaabe people of Clear Lake were forcibly removed and their houses burned down to make way for cottages for upper middle class people from the city for their summer vacations and such. So if you think about it, the legacy of nature conservation and parks and protected areas in Canada has this insidious side of it. And so when we talk about reconciliation in regards to how conservation of nature happens, that's the truth side.
Yeah.
You got to say the truth side, and then not get stuck. See, this is the thing, is where we don't want to get stuck in the negativity or any of that. We want to move forward in a good way. And that's why we're putting our best foot forward here to a model that we're calling Indigenous protected and conserved areas. Mm-hmm. But really, at the end of the day, what we're talking about is revitalizing and bringing to bear very old understandings of relationship in a modern context. And, so I don't know if that answers the question.
Yeah, it does. And okay, so that modern context, there's a lot to learn. There's a lot of great examples. Danika, I'll turn to you because I know that, well, you've participated in lots of different initiatives and examples that we can draw from, but in particular, Sahtu biosphere might be one that would be worth sharing with folks. And I'm going to stand up because the sun's coming out and I'm like looking ghostly and otherworldly. I'm going to close my curtain, but I'm listening. So can you tell us a little bit about the Sahtu Biosphere Reserve?
Sure. So back in 2016, in August of 2016, I had the pleasure of visiting the Billingay up near the Great Bear Lake area to launch the designation of the Sahtu Biosphere Reserve, home of the people of the Sahtu. And it was incredibly special because the Sahtu designation, being a UNESCO designation, which is an international designation within the UN system, was the first for the Northwest Territories and the first in Canada north of 60. And it was also the first UNESCO designation to ever have been completely stewarded through the UNESCO nomination process by Indigenous peoples themselves. And so that was really incredibly important. It actually proved to be quite significant for UNESCO as a UN organization. The reason for that was when you put in a nomination form for UNESCO designation like a biosphere reserve, most oftentimes those nominations include very important scientific evidence and social science evidence and testimonies of support, etc. But the Sahtu designation nomination form actually began with their Indigenous laws and their Indigenous systems. And so Delaney was sort of the first to bring a nomination form forward that began with an elucidation and honoring of its spiritual leaders, including Louis Aya, who was known as a prophet and who had predicted that Great Bear Lake would be the last source of clean water on the planet, and that the lake would become crowded. And in an effort to deal with this prophecy, and there was some deeply troubling experience that Delaney had with uranium mining at Port Radium and eastern Great Bear Lake that heightened the concern with the Delaney, and they chose to pursue a UNESCO designation as one sort of tool in their belt to protect Great Bear Lake, its ecological and cultural integrity, and its ecosystems. And they began actually with the recitation of their constitution, the Delaney Constitution, which talks about the role of their leaders and the wisdom and teachings of the prophet as well. And so when I attended the launch in Delaney in 2016, the representative from UNESCO Paris said that everybody at headquarters was completely blown away by the power of the nomination provided by the Satoué, by the Delaney, because it brought with it not just sort of the scientific basis and maybe some mention of culture, et cetera, but it actually had a very strong, firm foundation in their system and in their rationale for pursuing that designation. So it was really special and continues to be quite significant in the UN system.
Yeah, it sounds really special. Thanks for sharing that with all of us. I know that there are different names or different ways that you can designate Indigenous-led conservation, whether it's a biosphere, whether you go UNESCO, whether you go tribal park or a formal IPCA, but they're all, the key is they're all Indigenous-led. I think that's the most important thing. And you said with Satoué how it really just started with indigenous laws and knowledge. That's the key, the crux of it. So Eli, I know you have experiences with Cloquet Tribal Park, which is a different designation, but still an Indigenous-led initiative. Can you share with us a little bit about that?
Yeah, and I think it is remarkable that with Satoué that it's the first, I think, in the world that is Indigenous-led.
Yeah.
So if you know, and IPCAs is supposed to be this broad umbrella concept with various things underneath it. And in this case, you know, maybe there's a biosphere reserve in Canada. It wouldn't necessarily fit as an IPCA, but this, because it was led by Indigenous peoples, that could fit as, you know, in that category. So it's just a funny conversation about terminology and acronyms and whatnot, but everyone's favorite part of an initiative, by the way. And
the acronyms.
Yeah, let's find the right acronym. How will that look in the hashtag, you know? But just getting back to your question, yeah, we actually had an elder from Satoué and a youth actually come out to Clayoquot Sound in 2014, I believe. It was the first time UNESCO had held its AGM. The UNESCO, the Canadian Committee for UNESCO, hosted its AGM in Victoria, British Columbia, and we did a side trip to Clayoquot Sound with a small group of participants from the main conference, and they sent an elder and a youth from Satoué on that tour. And we did a tour of the Clayoquot Sound Biosphere Reserve and the tribal parks. So the Clayoquot Sound Biosphere Reserve is worth a mention here as well in that regard, because it is a unique 50-50 model. So half of the board of directors is from New Channel Central Region nations, and half are from the local communities, non-Indigenous communities. So it's really a reconciliation model, which, you know, should also be, reflected in this dialogue. And interestingly, within that context, there's this, the Biosphere Reserve designation in Clayoquot Sound came much later, but the tribal parks are sort of the foundational bridge. And I call it a bridge because, as described by one of Canada's premier native law specialists, Jack Woodward, that a tribal park can best be understood by average Canadians as a constitutional park. So federal government makes national parks, provinces make provincial parks, municipalities make municipal parks. Indigenous peoples, through Section 35 of the Canada Act of 1982, exercise constitutional agency, and therefore that bridge from Indigenous law, because first and foremost, a tribal park is an expression of in our case, Nuu-chah-nulth law, Iisaak Olam, and then it bridges into Canadian law through Section 35 and then interacts. And I think what really we're talking about, the buzz around Canada with conservation today and over the last few years, is really about that interesting space where that Indigenous law starts to interface with various levels of government. Sometimes it's a good experience, sometimes it's not. And so the tribal park model is playing in that interesting space of reconciliation, not only between Crown and Indigenous governments, but reconciliation with the land and finding alternative models, because our people are not environmentalists per se, and we're also not industrialists. And so we believe through Indigenous economic practice, like Indigenous, we had economy for thousands of years. We had our own type of economy, and it was based on observations of how Mother Nature organizes her own economy. How does natural law work? And if you are, if you're Iisaak, if you observe, appreciate, and act accordingly, then we can decipher some of her laws and the elegant solutions and the way that she manages waste systems and life and cycles with the sun and the moon. And if we can design human economies that are in sync with this type of these broader processes, then we can find successful ways of being prosperous, but also to live within those balances. So, tribal parks is an example of an IPCA. Mm-hmm. I'm biased, but I think it's one of the lead examples. Anyway.
You're allowed to be biased.
We've been doing it for 36 years now. And There's a trial and error, there's the good, the bad, and the ugly. So anyways, that's a few words on that. And it's an alternative model for bioregional economic development.
Well, thanks. There is a lot to learn, so I really appreciate hearing a bit about it. I'm looking at the comments, and people are saying that they're coming in from Mi'kma'ki, which is East Coast where I'm from, Mississaugas of Scugog Island. Someone's coming in from, I think I saw Esquimalt First Nations, so that's people are joining us from all over. Glenn, who's coming from unceded Algonquin territory, Eli, he noted that your piece about forest bathing is certainly something that resonated with him and something he's experienced about how we sort of pitch nature about this, whites only space of forest bathing and,
to de-stress from city life.
Yeah, exactly. Rural divide as well. And don't get me wrong, I'm all for forest bathing. I do a fair amount of it myself, but I don't want WWF, as an example, to fall into that old harmful way of conservation that you described at the outset. So I'd like to ask both of you, for conservation organizations, non-Indigenous conservation organizations, how can we support Indigenous-led conservation? And hey, not just us, but governments. What is it that we need in order to strengthen Indigenous-led conservation? You tell us what to do, we'll get on it. What are our marching orders? Maybe Danika, I'll start with you.
When we, as the ICE, completed and submitted our report, We Rise Together in 2018 under the Pathway to Canada Target 1 initiative, the 28 recommendations that we set out in the report, I think were really important in terms of providing like a base set of ideas and suggestions and guidance for how we might move forward into Indigenous-led conservation, where it is truly Indigenous-led. I think part of the challenge is that we need to sort of see some transformational shifts happen on multiple levels. I think within the conservation movement itself, and in particular amongst organizations like WWF, I think there's a really strong need for those organizations to prepare themselves adequately for engaging with Indigenous peoples, and also to be prepared to provide support and advocacy to bolster the role of Indigenous peoples within the conservation movement. And that may mean sort of maybe helping an Indigenous organization or community to access funding that would normally go to a larger organization for purposes around Indigenous issues, for example.
Yeah.
It may also mean looking hard at sort of the staff and volunteer folks who are engaged with that organization and ensuring that there's representation, adequate and appropriate representation of Indigenous peoples and people of color. And I think also it's really important to be able to try to meet Indigenous peoples where they are, and create sort of a new respect for Indigenous ways of co-creating relationship and understanding that there won't be a one-size-fits-all approach. I think if there's any sort of singular takeaway that I hope folks watching today are able to absorb, it's just the incredible diversity of Indigenous peoples everywhere, and their diversity in terms of who they are and identity and connection to lands and waters and spaces and places, but also in terms of their respective experiences and levels of engagement on issues of conservation. It may not be that they're using that particular language. They may be using entirely different language based on where they are and what they're experiencing. And so I think that's a part of it. And I really sincerely hope that, we see more folks, especially within the ENGO sector in the conservation movement, doing work like today's Facebook Live, and doing work also internally to look at their constating documents, things like their constitutions, their policies, and making sure that they're in line with basic minimum standards like the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, or IUCN guidance that's been, contributed to by Indigenous peoples or Indigenous peoples themselves. And I really encourage everyone who's part of a sort of a non-Indigenous organization who wants to work with Indigenous peoples to start where you live, to love where you live, to engage where you live, and hopefully it goes from there.
Those are great concrete steps for us. Thank you. Eli, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, sure. I think number one principle to adapt is do no harm. So look, there's things that you can do, but let's look at what things we can stop doing. That may be perpetuating old systems or harming relationships. And then another one is get to know yourself is one that I often say is because when working with when working in that space, oftentimes, if you meet somebody new and you get a business card right away, introducing yourself as a position in an organization that's the kind of bureaucracy that has been so problematic. So, and one of our elders from up north had said that it's not Indigenous peoples that need to be decolonized. It's so much. I mean, maybe there's a spectrum here, but anyways, his point was that it's the rest of Canadians that need to be decolonized, because what they attempted and what the colonial government attempted but failed to do to Indigenous peoples, they were successful in doing to their own people. So they attempted to erase our understanding of who we are, eradicate our language and culture, and disconnect our history and understanding of our relation to our land. And they were fairly, effective in creating damage with regards to those things, but they were not effective in completing their mandate. But to some degrees, they were successful in doing that to Canadian population, non-Indigenous Canadian population. Whereas I meet a lot of people in the work that I do who don't have a sense of community, who don't have a knowledge of who they are, the places where their ancestors came from, their own worldviews about things like water. Is water just H2O? I mean, in many old world societies, water is a sacred medicine.
Yeah.
And imagine how simple that is, but how powerful that can be to change the way that we treat water and how we treat the land. So get to know who you are. First, do no harm. Get to know who you are, and then thirdly, I would say adopt. Through adopting ethical space, figure out how to do that. How to adopt that as part of your operating systems. Strategic management long term, because you know what I mean, at the end of the day, adopting ethical space is going to improve your organization's ability to survive in this changing environment, and I think that you're going to get better results. So I would say I often am haunted by a conversation I had with an environmental organization, I guess about 6 or 7 years ago. And they were trying to explain to me that we are a conventional nature-based conservation organization. Cuddly panda bears and like the fish, or like the white spirit bear. We want a charismatic species, I think.
Yeah.
And I was explaining, in the first couple of rounds, I'm like very patient. I'm like, well, the best way to actually achieve that outcome is by supporting the Indigenous peoples who have thousands of years of track record relationship with those creatures. Think about it for a second, right? Like when Europeans arrived, there was an abundance of that thing that you're now so worried about conserving. Well, why was that? And how did those people manage to do that? And so by revitalizing Indigenous governance systems, culture, and language, that is the best roadmap to conserving those things.
Right.
And then it goes back into a loop, and they're like, well, we're sure the culture is important, the language is important, but we're really just more of a conventional nature-based organization. And then it'll go back around the merry-go-round, and like, so I think part of adopting ethical space is a paradigm shift, for recognizing that that it is not a disconnected world.
Yeah.
Iisaak Olam in the New Channel language means everything is one and everything is interconnected. And it's a nice thing to say, in a speech, or like put it on a hashtag or like a brochure. But then how do you walk the talk of Iisaak Olam? I challenge, nature-based organizations to do that. And the last bonus one I'm going to add in there, because I'm so, where I'm from, we don't have the peace and friendship treaties, but I've spoken with many peoples across Canada where they have the peace and friendship treaties, and they have recollection of what those are really about. And I'm often reminded of a public education campaign by the Chiefs of Manitoba years ago, which had a kind of like an image of children playing on a school ground park. and there was Native children and white children playing together. And the caption was, "We are all treaty people."
Mm.
So if you are if you are a citizen of this country, you're a treaty person as well.
Yeah.
That's the message from the chiefs, and the elders have said that to me time and time again, that people who are non-Indigenous also have roles and responsibilities
Mm-hmm.
in the peace and friendship treaties. And there's great wisdom in those things. There's great wisdom in the culture that King George and other European leaders stepped into those treaties. And they are treasures that we can shine bright and new again in this era of reconciliation.
And bringing it back to ethical space. What a wonderful way to end this. And speaking of treasures, both of you are treasures. Thank you so much for the gift of your time, the gift of your knowledge, and for sharing your experiences with us today. I really, really appreciate it. Thank you. And
thank you. Good job.
Yeah. And I do want to thank everybody who joined us. You'll see there's a link to the ICE report in the comments. So go ahead and take up the challenge that Danika offered all of us to read it and understand what these recommendations are and how we can actually participate and support Indigenous-led conservation in Canada. And if you do want to learn more about the Living Planet report, both Danika and Eli have a piece in the Living Planet Report Canada. Head to our Facebook page. You can watch some of the past Facebook Lives, do a deep dive there. And like I said at the beginning, the Living Planet Report does have some stark findings in it. Wildlife in Canada are in trouble. We can't ignore this, but there are solutions. And these solutions include Indigenous-led conservation. And that's something that we at WWF Canada are committed to supporting in any way we can. And we know that those of you who've joined us today agree and that you'll take up this challenge as well. Thanks, everyone.
Megan, are you going to promo we're going to do another follow-up. What is it?
Podcast?
We're going to do a podcast where we're going to get into some of the nitty-gritty.
That's right. You're right. I forgot to say that. So we will stay tuned. We'll post on our Facebook page. We're hoping to do a podcast where, as Eli put it, we can get into the nitty-gritty, get into some of the weeds for those of you that love weeds like we do. Thanks, Eli.
All right.
Thanks, everyone.
Hi. Thank you.